You're exactly the kind of desperate woman who would throw herself at a man like me for money. Probably rehearsed your sob story in the mirror this morning, didn't you?" The words sliced through Bia Silva like a blade, each syllable designed to destroy the last thread of hope she'd clung to during the bus ride here. Richard Blackwood, the real estate mogul whose steel blue eyes currently dissected her like a specimen, lounged behind his obsidian desk with the casual cruelty of a man who collected people's dreams just to crush them. The scent of his expensive cologne, something dark and commanding, mixed with the suffocating smell of leather and old money, making her stomach clench with the familiar ache of not belonging. What? Bia's voice cracked, her worn portfolio suddenly feeling like dead weight in her trembling hands. Behind her desperation lurked a more terrifying truth. If she didn't get this job, she'd lose her apartment in 3 days. Her elderly neighbor, Mrs. Chen, was already watching her daughter Sophia after school out of pity, not payment. "Let me paint the picture," Richard continued, rising from his chair with the fluid grace of a predator. His 6'3" frame dominated the space, every line of his custom midnight suit screaming power and privilege. Single mother drowning in medical bills? Eviction notice tucked in that sad little purse? You probably Googled how to seduce your boss before coming here. Each word hit like a physical blow, but it was the knowing smirk on his perfectly sculpted face that made her breath catch. He wasn't just guessing, he was reading her desperation like an open book. "You're wrong," Bia whispered, though they both knew he wasn't entirely. She straightened her shoulders, feeling the rough fabric of her secondhand blazer against her skin. "I'm here because your son needs someone who actually cares about children, not because I'm hunting for a meal ticket." Richard's laugh was rich, dark, and utterly without warmth. How delightfully naive. "Tell me, Miss Silva, Bia Silva." The name felt foreign on her tongue in this marble mausoleum of wealth. "Miss Silva." He circled her slowly, his expensive Italian leather shoes clicking against the polished floor like a countdown to her doom. "What happens when you can't make rent? When your precious principals don't pay for your daughters? What is it? Asthma medication? Dance classes? The little luxuries poor mothers sacrifice everything for?" The air left her lungs. How could he possibly know about Sophia's asthma, about the dance classes she'd had to cancel last month? "You've been watching me," she breathed, horror and violation warring in her chest. "I investigate all potential employees." His smile was razor sharp. "Especially ones desperate enough to work for what I pay and what I demand in return." The grandfather clock's tick seemed to thunder in the silence. Bia's fingers curled into fists, her short nails biting into her palms. Every fiber of her being screamed to run, to preserve what remained of her dignity. But Sophia's face flashed in her mind, her 8-year-old daughter asking why they couldn't afford the medicine that helped her breathe at night. "I need this job," she admitted, each word tasting like ash. "But not for the reasons you think." "Of course you do." Richard moved closer, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body, smell the hint of whiskey on his breath. "Here's what's going to happen. You'll care for my son Thomas. You'll follow my rules without question. And you'll remember that in my world, people like you are disposable." His voice dropped to a whisper that sent shivers down her spine. "Cross me, disappoint me, or develop any romantic fantasies about your employer, and I'll make sure you never work in this city again. Your daughter's future depends on how well you understand that reality." The threat hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Bia's heart hammered against her ribs, but she met his gaze without flinching. "I understand perfectly, Mr. Blackwood. You're a bastard who gets off on making people feel small. But your son still needs someone who'll actually love him, something you've obviously forgotten how to do." For a split second, something flickered across Richard's face. Surprise, perhaps even respect. Then the mask slammed back into place. "Mrs. Hampton will show you to your quarters," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "You start at dawn. And Miss Silva?" He leaned in close enough that his breath brushed her ear. "That fire in your eyes? It won't last. They never do. As the housekeeper appeared like a ghost in the doorway, Bea followed her toward the sweeping staircase. But not before she caught sight of the family portrait hanging in the shadows. Richard, younger and somehow softer, his arm around a radiant woman whose absence now seemed to echo through every cold corner of this mansion. The woman wore Bea's same defiant smile. And suddenly, she understood why Richard Blackwood was so determined to break her spirit before she could break his carefully constructed walls. The war between them had only just begun. "She called you a bastard? To your face?" Richard's jaw tightened as his business partner Marcus Chen leaned back in the leather chair across from his office desk, barely suppressing a grin. The morning sun streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long shadows that seemed to mock Richard's carefully controlled composure. "It's irrelevant," Richard muttered, signing contracts with more force than necessary. The memory of Bea Silva's blazing dark eyes refusing to look away still burned in his chest like acid. "She's desperate. They all are." "Right. That's why you've been stabbing that contract for the past 5 minutes." Marcus's knowing smirk widened. "When's the last time a woman called you out like that? Besides Elena, I mean." The pen snapped in Richard's grip. Elena. His dead wife's name hung in the air like a ghost, just as it had when he'd seen that same defiant fire in the new nanny's face. The same stubborn lift of the chin, the same refusal to be cowed by wealth and power. "Don't." The word came out sharp enough to cut glass. Meanwhile, 3 floors above, Bea Silva was discovering that caring for Thomas Blackwood was like trying to befriend a beautiful wounded bird that had forgotten how to sing. "You don't have to pretend to like me," the 7-year-old said matter-of-factly, not looking up from his tablet as she entered his bedroom. "Most people don't stay long enough to bother." The casual resignation in his voice, so achingly similar to his father's calculated cruelty, made Bea's heart clench. Thomas sat cross-legged on a bed large enough for 3 adults, surrounded by expensive toys that looked barely touched. His dark hair fell over eyes that were Richard's steel blue but without the bitter hardness. "What if I'm not most people?" Bea settled onto the edge of the bed, ignoring the way the silk comforter probably cost more than her monthly rent. Thomas finally looked up, studying her with the same intensity as his father. "You'll leave when Daddy makes you cry. They always do." The matter-of-fact delivery of that devastating truth hit harder than any of Richard's calculated insults. How many nannies had this child watched his father destroy? "Has your daddy made you cry?" she asked softly. "Daddies aren't supposed to make little boys cry," Thomas said, but his small hands clenched around the tablet. "That's what Mrs. Hampton says." Before Bea could respond, the bedroom door slammed open with enough force to rattle the frames on the walls. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Richard stood in the doorway like an avenging angel, his usually perfect hair disheveled, his tie loosened as if he'd run up 3 flights of stairs. His chest rose and fell rapidly beneath his white dress shirt, and something wild flickered in his eyes. "I'm talking to Thomas," Bea said, standing slowly. "You know my job? Your job is childcare, not therapy." He crossed the room in 3 long strides, his presence suddenly overwhelming in the spacious bedroom. "Thomas, go wash up for dinner." "But Daddy," Bea was, "Now!" The single word cracked like a whip. Thomas scrambled off the bed and fled toward his ensuite bathroom, shooting Bea an apologetic look that broke her heart. The moment they were alone, Richard's mask slipped completely. "Stay away from his head," he snarled, backing Bea against the massive bay window. The glass was cool against her spine, but his body radiated heat like a furnace. "You don't get to psychoanalyze my son or fill his head with false hope about people staying." "False hope?" Bea's voice rose despite the intimidating wall of muscle and fury inches from her face. "He's 7 years old and he thinks love is temporary. What kind of father? The kind who protects his son from getting attached to people who'll disappear the moment something better comes along." Richard's hands slammed against the window on either side of her head, trapping her. Just like his mother did. The words hung between them like a live wire, crackling with pain so raw it made Bea gasp. This close, she could see the exhaustion carved into the sharp lines of his face Smell the whiskey on his breath that spoke of sleepless nights and liquid bandages for wounds that refused to heal. She left, Bia whispered. She died. The words came out broken, barely audible. Car accident. She was driving away from us, from me, when it happened. The admission seemed to shock him back to reality. Richard jerked away as if she'd burned him, his face shuddering closed like steel doors slamming shut. That information doesn't leave this room, he said, his voice deadly quiet. And if you use it to manipulate my son or me, I'll destroy you so completely, you'll wish you'd never been born. But as he turned to leave, Bia saw what he was really afraid of. Not that she'd use his pain against him, but that she might understand it. That she might see past the armor to the man underneath who was drowning in guilt and grief. Richard. His name left her lips before she could stop it. He froze at the doorway, his broad shoulders rigid with tension. I'm not going anywhere, she said softly. Not until you fire me. He didn't turn around, but she saw his hands clench into fists at his sides. Then I guess I'll have to make sure that happens sooner rather than later, he said, and walked away, leaving Bia alone with the echo of his footsteps and the terrible certainty that she was about to fall for a man who was determined to break her heart before she could heal his. From the bathroom came the sound of Thomas quietly crying, and Bia realized that some wounds ran so deep they infected entire families. But she'd survived worse than Richard Blackwood's emotional warfare, and she was about to prove it. The war began at exactly 6:47 a.m. when Bia discovered that Richard had moved her alarm clock forward by 2 hours. Overslept on your second day? His voice dripped false concern as she rushed into the kitchen, still buttoning her blouse. He sat at the marble breakfast bar like a king holding court, immaculate in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than her car. How predictable. The housekeeper, Mrs. Hampton, shot Bia a sympathetic look while serving Richard's coffee in bone china that gleamed like captured moonlight. The older woman's slight headshake confirmed what Bia already suspected. This was just the opening move in Richard's campaign to drive her away. Thomas needs to be at school in 20 minutes, Richard continued, his steel blue eyes tracking her every move as she poured cereal for the boy. I trust that won't be a problem for someone with your extensive experience? The emphasis on extensive made it clear exactly what he thought of her qualifications. But before Bia could respond, Thomas looked up from his barely touched breakfast. Daddy, why did you tell Jenkins to move Bia's clock? His innocent question hung in the air like a dropped bomb. Richard's coffee cup froze halfway to his lips. For a split second, his mask slipped, revealing something almost like shame before the familiar coldness reasserted itself. Eat your breakfast, Thomas, but you said, now. The sharp command made Thomas flinch, but it was the wounded confusion in the child's eyes that made Bia's protective instincts flare. She crouched beside his chair, deliberately ignoring the dangerous energy radiating from his father. Hey, want to know a secret? She whispered conspiratorially. I used to be late for everything too. But then I learned something magical. Thomas leaned closer, his breakfast forgotten. What? Even when grown-ups try to trick us, we can still choose to be kind. She glanced meaningfully at Richard, whose knuckles had gone white around his coffee cup. That's real power. That's enough, Richard's voice cut through the moment like a blade. Thomas Carr. Now. As father and son left for school, Richard paused at the kitchen doorway. The look he gave Bia could have frozen hellfire itself. Clever, he said softly. But you have no idea what you're dealing with. The threat should have terrified her. Instead, Bia found herself smiling. Neither do you. By noon, she understood exactly how right she'd been. Richard's retaliation was swift and merciless. The Wi-Fi password was changed. Her access card to Thomas's wing mysteriously stopped working. The grocery delivery she'd ordered for his lunch was canceled, along with her credit card authorization. But the final straw came when she found her few personal belongings packed in a cardboard box outside her bedroom door, with a note in Richard's precise handwriting. Subletting arrangement terminated. 30 days notice effective immediately. Bia stared at the box containing her life, her daughter Sophia's school photo, the cheap jewelry that had been her mother's, the worn copy of Jane Eyre that had gotten her through the darkest nights. Her hand shook as rage and desperation warred in her chest. He was trying to make her homeless. Again. "Son of a bitch," she whispered, then immediately looked around to make sure Thomas hadn't heard. The last thing the boy needed was more evidence that the adults in his life were falling apart. But when Thomas came home from school an hour later, his small face brightened at seeing her still there. "You didn't leave." The pure joy in his voice was like a knife to her heart. "Not yet, sweetheart." She hugged him tight, breathing in the scent of his shampoo and childhood innocence. "Want to help me make cookies?" They were elbow-deep in flour and chocolate chips when Richard returned home early, clearly expecting to find her gone. Instead, he discovered his pristine kitchen transformed into a war zone of baking chaos, his son laughing, actually laughing for the first time in months. "What is this?" The words came out strangled, as if the sound of his child's happiness physically hurt him. "We made cookies." Thomas held up a misshapen blob of dough with the pride of a master sculptor. "Look, Daddy, this one looks like a dinosaur." Richard's face went through a series of emotions too complex to name. When his gaze met Bia's over Thomas's head, the raw pain in his eyes made her breath catch. "Thomas, go wash up," he said quietly. "Bia and I need to talk." Once they were alone, the kitchen felt too small to contain the electricity crackling between them. Richard moved closer, backing her against the marble countertop where cookie sheets cooled nearby. The sweet scent of vanilla and chocolate mingled with his expensive cologne, creating an intoxicating cocktail that made her head spin. "I told you to stay away from his head," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "Making him happy, making him hope. It's cruel." "What's cruel is a father who's afraid of his own son's joy." Bia planted her hands on his chest, feeling his heart hammering beneath the expensive fabric. "When's the last time you heard him laugh like that?" "It doesn't matter." But his voice cracked slightly, betraying him. "It's the only thing that matters." She rose on her tiptoes, bringing her face inches from his. "You're so busy protecting him from getting hurt that you're the one hurting him." For a moment, they stared at each other in the charged silence. Richard's breathing was ragged, his pupils dilated. The kitchen island pressed against Bia's back as he leaned closer, his hands braced on either side of her. "You don't understand," he whispered, his breath warm against her lips. "Everyone leaves. Everyone dies. Everyone—" "I'm right here," she interrupted, her voice barely audible. "I'm right here, and I'm not going anywhere." Something broke in Richard's expression. A crack in the armor he'd worn for so long it had become his skin. His hand rose as if to touch her face, and for one heart-stopping moment, Bia thought he might kiss her. Instead, he jerked away as if she'd burned him. "Your belongings will be returned to your room," he said, his voice carefully controlled again. "But this changes nothing. You're still temporary. They all are." He started to leave, then paused at the doorway without turning around. "And Bia, next time you want to teach my son about kindness, remember who's paying for the lesson." As his footsteps faded down the hallway, Bia touched her lips, still tingling from his almost kiss. In the distance, she could hear Thomas chattering excitedly to Mrs. Hampton about the cookies, his young voice bright with hope. Richard Blackwood thought he was protecting his son from heartbreak. But Bia was beginning to realize that the person who needed protecting most was Richard himself, from the prison of guilt and fear he'd built around his own heart. And she was the only one with the key to set him free. The charity gala invitation arrived like a declaration of war, hand-delivered by Richard's assistant with instructions that made Bia's blood run cold. "Mr. Blackwood requires your attendance at tonight's Children's Hospital fundraiser," the young woman recited mechanically. "You're to accompany Thomas as his companion. The dress has been selected and will arrive within the hour." Bia stared at the elegant cardstock, her hands trembling slightly. She knew a trap when she saw one. Richard was planning to humiliate her in front of the city's elite, probably hoping she'd flee in shame before dessert was served. "Tell Mr. Blackwood I'll be delighted to attend," she said sweetly, though her stomach churned with dread. When the dress arrived, Bia understood just how calculated Richard's cruelty could be. The gown was stunning. Midnight blue silk that would cling to every curve, with a neckline that was just shy of scandalous. It was also clearly expensive enough to make every socialite at the gala aware that she was Richard's employee. Mrs. Hampton appeared in the doorway as Bea held up the dress, her weathered face creased with sympathy. 20 years I've worked for this family, the older woman said quietly. Never seen him this rattled by anyone. Even Miss Elena took months to get under his skin like this. Elena, Bea repeated, the name of Richard's dead wife sitting heavy on her tongue. What was she like? Mrs. Hampton's expression softened. Fierce, stubborn, refused to let him buy her way out of arguments. She paused, studying Bea with knowing eyes. She would have liked you, and that terrifies him. 3 hours later, Bea descended the mansion's grand staircase feeling like she was walking to her own execution. The dress fit like it had been made for her, which, knowing Richard's obsessive attention to detail, it probably had been. Her dark hair was swept into an elegant updo that showed off the delicate earrings she'd borrowed from Mrs. Hampton, and for the first time in years, she felt beautiful. The feeling lasted exactly until she saw Richard waiting in the foyer. He stood with his back to her, magnificent in a black tuxedo that emphasized his broad shoulders and lean waist. When he turned at the sound of her heels on marble, the expression that crossed his face was like watching a man see a ghost. Jesus, he breathed, then caught himself. You'll do. But his eyes told a different story. They raked over her with an intensity that made her skin burn, lingering on the curve of her neck, the line of her collarbone exposed by the dress's design. When their gazes finally met, the hunger she saw there nearly buckled her knees. Daddy, you look funny, Thomas observed, appearing beside them in a miniature tuxedo that made him look heartbreakingly grown up. Like when you saw Mommy's picture yesterday. The comment hit like a physical blow. Richard's face went white, then flushed with anger. Car, now, he said through gritted teeth. The drive to the hotel was a study in barely controlled tension. Richard sat rigidly in the back of the limousine, his jaw clenched so tight Bea was surprised it didn't crack. Thomas chatted excitedly about the party, oblivious to the storm brewing between the adults. But it was when they arrived at the Ritz-Carlton that Bea truly understood what she was walking into. The ballroom glittered with crystal and candlelight, filled with the kind of people whose jewelry alone could fund small countries. Every head turned as Richard Blackwood made his entrance, but it was the whispers that followed that made Bea's cheeks burn. Who's the woman? Definitely not from our circle. I heard he hired a new nanny. You don't think he's actually... Richard Blackwood slumming with the help? Delicious scandal. Beside her, Richard's hand found the small of her back, guiding her through the crowd with possessive familiarity. His touch burned through the silk of her dress, sending shivers down her spine even as his public claim on her made her want to disappear. Smile, he murmured in her ear, his breath warm against her neck. You're about to meet the vultures. The first attack came from Victoria Ashford, a platinum blonde whose smile could cut glass. Richard, darling, and this must be Thomas's new caregiver. The pause before caregiver was loaded with meaning. How refreshing to see you mixing with different social circles. Victoria. Richard's voice was smooth as silk and twice as dangerous. Still married to Harold, or have you moved on to richer prey? The woman's smile faltered, but before she could respond, Thomas tugged on Bea's dress. I need the bathroom, he whispered, clearly overwhelmed by the crowd. I'll take him, Bea said, grateful for the excuse to escape. Oh, how sweet, Victoria purred. The nanny knows her place. Something dark flashed in Richard's eyes. Careful, Victoria. Your jealousy is showing. But as Bea led Thomas away, she heard the woman's parting shot. I wonder how long this one will last. Your track record with the help isn't exactly stellar. In the bathroom, Thomas looked up at her with worried eyes. Are you going to leave because the mean lady was nasty? Bea knelt beside him, straightening his little bow tie. Is that what you're worried about? He nodded solemnly. Daddy gets angry when people are mean to people he When people are mean to people who work for us. And then they always leave. The innocent revelation hit like a sledgehammer. How many times had Richard's protective instincts backfired, driving away the very people Thomas had grown attached to? "I'm not going anywhere, sweetheart," she promised, though she wasn't sure she could keep it. When they returned to the ballroom, Richard was standing alone by the bar, his usual crowd of admirers notably absent. The tension in his shoulders was visible even across the room. "Everything all right?" Bia asked as they rejoined him. "Perfect," he said, downing his whiskey in one gulp. "Victoria always brings out my charming side." But as the evening progressed, Bia began to see another side of Richard Blackwood, the man who donated millions to children's charities without fanfare, who remembered the names of every hospital staff member, who watched his son with such fierce love it took her breath away. It was during the auction that everything changed. Thomas had fallen asleep against Bia's shoulder, exhausted by the long evening. She was gently stroking his hair when she felt eyes on her, and looked up to find Richard watching them with an expression of such raw longing, it made her chest ache. For a moment, the ballroom full of people faded away. There was only the three of them, a broken man, a child who needed love, and a woman who was beginning to realize she'd do anything to protect them both. $500,000! The auctioneer's voice snapped them back to reality. Richard had apparently bid on something, a week in Tuscany without even looking at the lot. "Richard," Bia whispered, "you just spent $500,000 on a vacation." He shrugged, but she caught the slight tremor in his hands. "Tax write-off." As they prepared to leave, Victoria appeared one last time, her smile sharp with malice. "Such a touching family tableau," she said, loud enough for nearby tables to hear. "One might almost forget that some people in this room are here to work, not to play dress-up." The insult hung in the air like poison gas. Around them, conversations quieted as the elite waited for the show. Richard went very still beside her, and Bia felt the danger radiating from him like heat from a forge. When he spoke, his voice was soft and absolutely deadly. "Victoria, I'd be very careful about questioning anyone's place here tonight. After all, we both know exactly how you earned your invitation to these events, and it wasn't through charity work." The woman's face went white, then red with fury, but before she could respond, Richard continued. "Bia is here because she's brilliant, compassionate, and worth 10 of you on your best day. Question her place again and you'll find yourself permanently uninvited to any event I sponsor. And since that's most of them," he smiled, showing teeth, "well, I'm sure you understand." The public claiming, the fierce protection, the way he said her name like a prayer, it all combined to steal Bia's breath completely. Around them, the silence was deafening. Victoria fled without another word. "You didn't have to do that," Bia whispered, as they walked to the car, Thomas still sleeping in her arms. "Yes," Richard said quietly, opening the limousine door for her. "I did." As the city lights blurred past the windows on the drive home, Bia realized that something fundamental had shifted between them. Richard had just publicly claimed her as his equal, defending her honor like a knight from one of the fairy tales she read to Thomas. But protection came with a price, and Bia was beginning to understand that falling for Richard Blackwood might cost her more than just her heart. It might cost her everything. The photograph appeared on the society pages the next morning like a nuclear bomb wrapped in newsprint. Bia stared at the image over her coffee cup, her heart hammering against her ribs. There she was, caught in perfect clarity as Richard's hand rested possessively on her back, his body angled protectively toward her while Thomas slept peacefully in her arms. The caption read, "Real Estate Mogul. Richard Blackwood makes public debut with mystery woman at Children's Hospital Gala." But it was the smaller photo in the corner that made her blood run cold, a paparazzi shot of them in the limousine. Richard's face turned toward her with an expression of such naked longing, it was almost obscene in its intimacy. "Shit," she whispered, then immediately looked around to make sure Thomas hadn't heard. Her phone buzzed, then buzzed again, and again. "Sophia." "Mom, is that you?" You look like a princess. Unknown number. Gold-digging whore. Another unknown. How much is he paying you? Her landlord. Saw the paper. Rent's going up. By the time Richard's assistant called to inform her that several reporters were camped outside the mansion's gates, Bea felt like she was drowning in a sea of unwanted attention. Mr. Blackwood would like to see you in his office immediately, the woman said, her tone professionally neutral but edged with something that sounded like pity. Bea found Richard standing behind his desk like a general surveying a battlefield, his usually perfect hair disheveled as if he'd been running his hands through it. The newspaper was spread open before him, and when he looked up, his steel blue eyes were wild with something between fury and panic. "This," he said, jabbing at the photograph, "is exactly what I was trying to prevent." "You were trying to prevent being photographed at a public event?" Bea kept her voice level despite the hurt clawing at her chest. "How remarkably naive of you." "Don't." The word cracked like a whip. "Don't make jokes. Do you have any idea what you've done?" "What I've done?" The unfairness of it hit like a slap. "I went where you told me to go, wore what you told me to wear, and smiled when you told me to smile. The only thing I did wrong was let you defend me." Richard rounded the desk with predatory grace, backing her against the wall of floor-to-ceiling windows. Outside, she could see the photographers with their long lenses, circling like vultures waiting for carrion. "Those people out there will tear you apart," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "They'll dig into every corner of your life, every mistake you've ever made, every moment of weakness. They'll find your daughter's school, your ex-boyfriend's secrets, your mother's medical records." "Stop." Bea's hands came up to press against his chest, feeling his heart racing beneath the expensive fabric of his shirt. "Just stop." But he couldn't stop, the words pouring out like water through a broken dam. "They'll make you famous for all the wrong reasons. They'll call you a gold digger, a social climber, a slut who seduced her way into my bed. Is that what you think I am?" The quiet question stopped him mid-sentence. They stood frozen, inches apart, both breathing hard. Richard's eyes were wild, desperate, and when he spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. "I think you're the most dangerous woman I've ever met." "Dangerous how?" His hands came up to frame her face, his thumbs tracing the curve of her cheekbones with devastating gentleness. "You make me want things I swore I'd never want again. You make me hope for things I buried with my wife. You make me forget why I built these walls in the first place." The admission hung between them like a loaded gun. Bea could feel the heat radiating from his body, smell the intoxicating mixture of his cologne and something uniquely him. When she spoke, her voice was steady despite the chaos in her chest. "Then maybe it's time to tear them down." Something broke in Richard's expression, a crack in the foundation of his carefully constructed control. His thumb brushed across her lower lip, and she saw the exact moment he stopped fighting himself. "Bea," he breathed, and then his mouth was on hers. The kiss was nothing like she'd imagined. It wasn't gentle or tentative. It was desperate, hungry. Years of loneliness and need poured into the joining of their lips. His hands tangled in her hair, destroying her careful styling while she gripped the lapels of his suit jacket as if he were her only anchor in a storm. He tasted like coffee and whiskey and something darker, more addictive. When his tongue swept across her lower lip, she opened for him with a gasp that made him groan deep in his throat. The sound sent fire racing through her veins and she pressed closer, wanting more, needing, "Daddy." They sprang apart like guilty teenagers, both breathing hard. Thomas stood in the doorway, his young face creased with confusion and something that looked suspiciously like hope. "Thomas." Richard's voice was rough, unsteady. "You should be in school." "I forgot my dinosaur book." The boy's eyes moved between them, taking in their disheveled appearance with the sharp intelligence he'd inherited from his father. "Were you kissing Bea?" The question hung in the air like an unexploded bomb. Bea felt her cheeks burning, but it was the panic in Richard's eyes that made her heart break. We were..." Richard started, then stopped, clearly drowning. "Yes," Bea said quietly, stepping forward. "Your daddy was kissing me." Thomas's face lit up like Christmas morning. Does that mean you're going to marry us? The innocent question hit like a physical blow. Richard went white, his breathing becoming shallow and rapid. Bea recognized the signs of a panic attack and moved instinctively toward him, but he backed away as if she carried plague. No, he said, his voice barely recognizable. No, Thomas. Bea works for us. That's all. She's not. We're not. He couldn't finish the sentence. Instead, he fled, leaving Bea alone with a 7-year-old whose face had crumpled with disappointment and rejection. Did I say something wrong? Thomas whispered, tears gathering in his eyes. Bea knelt beside him, pulling him into her arms even as her own heart shattered. No, sweetheart, you didn't do anything wrong. Sometimes grown-ups get scared of their feelings. Is Daddy scared of loving you? The question was so perceptive, so heartbreakingly accurate, that Bea had to swallow hard before she could answer. I think your daddy is scared of losing people he loves, she said carefully. Sometimes when people have been hurt before, they think the best way to protect themselves is to not love anyone at all. Thomas pulled back to look at her with those steel blue eyes that were so like his father's. But that's dumb. Love doesn't hurt people. Missing love hurts people. The wisdom of children never ceased to amaze her. You're absolutely right. So you'll help him remember how to not be scared? Bea looked out the window at the photographers still circling, then at the newspaper with its damning images of a moment she couldn't take back. Richard had just kissed her like his life depended on it, then run the moment his son suggested something permanent. She was in love with a man who would rather destroy himself than risk being happy. But as she looked down at Thomas's hopeful face, she realized she was already too deep to run. Richard Blackwood might be determined to push her away, but she'd made a promise to a little boy who deserved better than a father who was afraid of his own heart. Yeah, sweetheart, she said, pressing a kiss to the top of his head. I'll help him remember. Outside, the photographers kept circling, and somewhere in the mansion Richard was probably convincing himself that what had just happened was a mistake. But Bea Silva had been fighting uphill battles her entire life, and she'd be damned if she was going to lose this one, even if it meant saving Richard Blackwood from himself. Richard didn't come home for 3 days. Bea learned this from Mrs. Hampton, who delivered the news with the grim satisfaction of someone who'd watched this particular tragedy play out before. Holed up in his downtown office like a wounded animal, the housekeeper said, setting down Thomas's breakfast with more force than necessary. Same thing he did after Miss Elena's funeral. Stayed away for 2 weeks that time, convinced himself that distance would make the pain stop. Thomas pushed his cereal around his bowl without eating, dark circles under his eyes, testament to the nights he'd spent waiting for his father's footsteps in the hallway. Is Daddy angry at me? The question broke Bea's heart all over again. No, sweetheart. Your daddy is angry at himself. But anger was too simple a word for what Richard was feeling, as Bea discovered when she arrived at his office building that evening. The Blackwood Tower rose 43 floors into the Seattle skyline, all glass and steel and brutal ambition. Bea had never felt smaller than she did walking through the marble lobby in her simple jeans and sweater, past security guards who clearly recognized her from the newspapers. She found Richard on the 39th floor, alone in a conference room that probably cost more than most people's houses. He stood with his back to the door, silhouetted against floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a commanding view of the city he'd conquered. He didn't turn around when she entered, but she saw his shoulders tense. You shouldn't be here, he said, his voice rough with exhaustion and something else, something that sounded dangerously like relief. Thomas asked me to bring you this. Bea set a hand-drawn picture on the conference table, a child's rendering of 3 stick figures holding hands under a rainbow. He's worried you're never coming home. Richard's reflection in the window showed her his eyes closing in pain. Maybe that would be better for everyone. Spoken like a true coward. That got his attention. He spun around, and Bea gasped at what she saw. Richard looked like he hadn't slept in days, his usually perfect hair disheveled, his dress shirt wrinkled and open at the collar. But it was the haunted look in his eyes that made her want to cross the room and gather him in her arms. Careful, he said, his voice dangerously soft. You're talking to a man who could destroy your life with a phone call. You already tried that, remember? The clock, the credit cards, the eviction notice? Bia moved closer, noting how he backed away like a cornered animal. Funny how you keep threatening to destroy me, but the only person you're actually destroying is yourself. You don't understand. I understand perfectly. She kept advancing until he had nowhere to go but the wall of windows behind him. You're terrified that if you love someone, they'll leave you. So you push everyone away first, convince yourself it's protection when it's really just surrender. Elena didn't leave. Richard snarled, his composure finally cracking. She died. She died because she was driving away from me. Because I said things, terrible things. Because I was angry and hurt and too proud to... His voice broke. She died hating me. The confession hung in the air between them like a bleeding wound. Bia could see it all now. The guilt that had been eating him alive for 2 years. The conviction that love was just another word for inevitable loss. What did you fight about? She asked gently. Richard laughed, but it sounded more like a sob. Money. Always money. She wanted to donate more to charity. I said we couldn't afford it. She accused me of caring more about profit than people. I accused her of being naive about how the world really works. He ran his hands through his hair, destroying what remained of his professional facade. Our last words to each other were cruel. She died, thinking I was a monster. You're not a monster, Bia said quietly. You're a man who's been carrying someone else's pain for so long you've forgotten how to put it down. You don't know what you're talking about, don't I? She reached into her purse and pulled out a worn photograph, Sophia laughing on a swing set, her face bright with joy. My daughter's father walked out when she was diagnosed with asthma. Said he couldn't handle the medical bills, the stress, the responsibility. She tucked the photo away carefully. For 2 years, I was convinced it was my fault. That if I'd been prettier, smarter, more successful, he would have stayed. Richard's eyes fixed on her face with laser intensity. That's different. Is it? We both loved people who left us. The difference is, you're letting that abandonment turn you into the very thing you're afraid of becoming. Someone who hurts the people who love him. The words hit like physical blows. Richard flinched, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. Thomas doesn't love me, he said quietly. He's afraid of me. I see it in his eyes every time I walk into a room. He's not afraid of you, Bia said, her heart breaking at the pain in his voice. He's afraid of losing you. There's a difference. I can't be what he needs. I can't be what anyone needs. Every time I try to love someone, I destroy them. Bia closed the distance between them in 2 quick steps, her hands coming up to frame his face. He tried to pull away, but she held firm. Look at me, she commanded. When he reluctantly met her eyes, she saw the lost little boy hiding behind the billionaire's mask. You didn't destroy Elena. A drunk driver destroyed Elena. You didn't destroy Thomas. You've been protecting him the only way you know how. And you haven't destroyed me, no matter how hard you've tried. I kissed you, Richard whispered, as if confessing to murder. I crossed every line I swore I'd never cross. Yes, you did. Bia's thumbs traced the sharp line of his cheekbones, feeling the tension that lived there like permanent armor. And it was the most honest thing you've done since I met you. It can't happen again. Why? Because you might actually be happy for 5 minutes? The question seemed to shatter something inside him. His hands came up to cover hers, his eyes closing as if he were in physical pain. Because I can't lose you too, he breathed. And if I let myself fall for you, really fall, I'll find a way to drive you away just like I drove her away. Then don't drive me away. Bia rose on her tiptoes, bringing her face inches from his. Fight for me instead. Fight for us. Fight for the chance to be happy even if it scares you to death. For a moment she thought he might kiss her again. His breathing was ragged, his pupils dilated, and she could feel the war raging inside him, fear against hope, guilt against desire, the need to protect himself against the need to be loved. But then his phone buzzed with an incoming call, shattering the moment. Richard jerked away as if she'd burned him, his walls slamming back into place with devastating efficiency. "This was a mistake," he said, his voice carefully controlled again. "You should go." Bea stared at him for a long moment, seeing the man he could be flickering behind the mask he wore like armor. Then she picked up Thomas's drawing from the conference table. "Your son made this for you," she said quietly. "It's a picture of our family. He still believes we could be one, even after everything you've put him through." She set the drawing in front of him. "The question is, what are you going to choose, fear or love?" As she walked toward the door, Richard's voice stopped her. "Bea." She turned, hope fluttering in her chest like a trapped bird. "Tell Thomas I'll be home tomorrow," he said quietly. "And tell him his daddy is sorry. It wasn't everything." But as Bea rode the elevator down 43 floors, she realized it was enough. For now. Outside, the city lights twinkled like fallen stars, and somewhere in the distance, a little boy was waiting for his father to come home and remember how to love again. The war wasn't over. But maybe, just maybe, love was finally winning. Richard came home to find his son teaching Bea how to play chess in the garden, their laughter carrying through the evening air like music he'd forgotten how to hear. He stood at the French doors, still in his wrinkled suit from the office, watching as Thomas moved his knight with the serious concentration of a master strategist. Bea sat cross-legged on the blanket they'd spread beneath the oak tree, her hair catching the golden light of sunset. And for a moment, Richard forgot how to breathe. She looked like she belonged there, like she'd always belonged there. "Daddy!" Thomas spotted him first, scrambling to his feet with the pure joy of a child whose world had suddenly righted itself. "You came home!" The boy launched himself into Richard's arms with enough force to nearly knock him over. Richard caught him instinctively, burying his face in his son's hair and breathing in the scent of childhood and innocence and unconditional love. "I promised I would," he said quietly, his voice rough with emotion. Over Thomas's head, his eyes met Bea's. She was watching them with an expression so tender it made his chest ache, and when she smiled, that radiant, forgiving smile that lit up her entire face, Richard felt something inside him crack open like an egg. "We saved you some dinner," Thomas said, pulling back to look at his father with those steel blue eyes that saw too much. "Bea made your favorite. She said comfort food helps sad people feel better." "Did she now?" Richard's gaze never left Bea's face as she rose gracefully from the blanket, smoothing down her simple sundress. The sight of her in his garden, surrounded by the roses Elena had planted, should have felt like betrayal. Instead, it felt like coming home. "She's really smart," Thomas continued with the earnest intensity of youth. "She knows lots of things about feelings and being brave and why grown-ups sometimes get scared of being happy." The innocent observation hit like a physical blow. Richard's arms tightened around his son as shame washed over him in waves. 3 days. He'd abandoned his child for 3 days because he was too much of a coward to face his own feelings. "Thomas," he said carefully, "I owe you an apology. Daddy was scared, and instead of being brave like you taught me, I ran away. That was wrong." "It's okay," Thomas said with the quick forgiveness of childhood. Bea explained about grown-up fears. She said sometimes when people love each other very much, they get scared the love will go away, so they try to hide from it. Richard's eyes snapped to Bea's face. She met his gaze steadily, a faint blush coloring her cheeks. "Is that what Bea said?" His voice was carefully neutral, but something hot and dangerous flickered in his chest. "Uh-huh. And she said the best way to stop being scared is to be brave together. Like a team." Thomas wiggled down from his father's arms and grabbed both their hands, trying to pull them closer together. "We could be a team, couldn't we? The 3 of us." The hope in his son's voice was devastating. Richard looked down at their joined hands, Thomas's small fingers connecting him to Bea like a bridge across troubled water, and felt the walls he'd spent 2 years building begin to crumble. "Thomas," Bea said gently, "why don't you go wash up for dinner? Your daddy and I need to talk." "About team stuff?" Thomas asked hopefully. About team stuff, she confirmed, and the boy raced toward the house with the enthusiasm of someone who believed in happy endings. Once they were alone, the garden felt too small to contain the electricity crackling between them. Bea stood just out of reach, her hands clasped in front of her like a shield, while Richard fought the urge to close the distance and finish what they'd started in his office. "Thank you," he said finally, "for staying. For taking care of him while I was—" He gestured helplessly. "Being human?" Bea suggested, her tone gentle but firm. "Having feelings? Dealing with trauma in the only way you knew how?" "Being a coward," Richard corrected harshly. "Running away when things got complicated?" "You came back?" The simple statement hit him like lightning. She was right. He had come back. For the first time in 2 years, instead of disappearing completely, he'd found his way home. "I couldn't stay away," he admitted. The words dragged from somewhere deep in his chest. "I tried. God knows I tried. But every night I closed my eyes, I saw you. I heard your voice telling me to fight for what I wanted instead of running from it." Bea took a step closer, and Richard caught her scent on the evening breeze. Vanilla and jasmine and something uniquely her. "What do you want, Richard?" The question hung between them like a challenge. Richard could feel the moment balanced on a knife's edge. He could retreat back into safety, into the familiar armor of cynicism and control, or he could take the leap that terrified him more than any business deal ever had. "I want you," he said quietly, the admission falling from his lips like a prayer. "I want to come home to you and Thomas laughing in the garden. I want to wake up next to you and know that you're not going anywhere. I want to stop being afraid of my own happiness." Bea's breath caught audibly. "Richard, I know I don't deserve it," he continued, the words pouring out now like water through a broken dam. "I know I've been cruel and controlling and terrified of everything you represent. But I'm tired, Bea. I'm so damn tired of being alone, of pushing away everyone who tries to love me, of being the man Elena accused me of being in our last fight." "What did she accuse you of being?" "Selfish, cold, someone who cared more about protecting his assets than protecting the people he claimed to love." Richard laughed bitterly. "She was right. I've spent 2 years proving her right." Bea closed the distance between them in 3 quick steps, her hands coming up to frame his face just as she had in his office. But this time he didn't pull away. "She was wrong," Bea said fiercely, her dark eyes blazing with conviction. "You're not selfish. You're terrified. You're not cold. You're drowning in feelings you don't know how to handle. And you don't care more about assets than people. You care so much about people that you'd rather destroy yourself than risk losing them." "How can you see that?" Richard whispered, his hands coming up to cover hers. "How can you see anything good in me when I've given you every reason to run? Because I love you, you impossible man." The words came out steady and sure, without hesitation or doubt. "I love your broken edges and your protective instincts and the way you'd rather hurt yourself than hurt Thomas. I love that you donated $500,000 to children's charities without thinking twice, and I love that you defended me to your awful friends even though it cost you." Richard stared at her in wonder as if she were speaking a foreign language. "You love me?" "I love you," she confirmed, rising on her tiptoes until their faces were inches apart. "The question is, are you brave enough to love me back?" For a moment, Richard felt suspended between his old life and his new one, between the man who pushed everyone away and the man who might be brave enough to hold on. In the distance, he could hear Thomas chattering to Mrs. Hampton about chess strategies, his young voice bright with the confidence of a child who believed his family was finally complete. "I'm terrified," Richard admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know," Bea said, her thumbs tracing the line of his cheekbones with devastating tenderness. "Be terrified, be brave, be both. Just don't be alone anymore." And then she kissed him, soft and sweet and full of promise. This time there was no desperation, no hunger born of loneliness and denial. This was a kiss that tasted like hope, like coming home. like the possibility of happily ever after for people who thought they'd lost their chance at love. When they finally broke apart, Richard rested his forehead against hers, his breathing unsteady. "I love you too," he whispered, the words falling from his lips like a benediction. "God help me. I love you too." From the house came the sound of Thomas calling for dinner, his voice carrying the impatience of a hungry 7-year-old. But neither Richard nor Bea moved, content to stand in the garden as the stars began to appear overhead, holding each other like they'd finally found their way home. The war between fear and love wasn't over. It might never be completely over. But for the first time in 2 years, Richard Blackwood was ready to believe that love might actually win. 6 months later, Victoria Ashford stood at the back of St. Mark's Cathedral, her face a mask of barely controlled fury as she watched Richard Blackwood marry his former nanny in front of Seattle's most elite society. "Absolutely revolting," she whispered to her companion, a socialite whose name Bea had never bothered to learn. "A billionaire marrying the help. What's next, democracy?" But her venom couldn't touch the radiance that surrounded Bea as she walked down the aisle in Elena's wedding dress, altered with loving care by Mrs. Hampton, who had tearfully insisted that Miss Elena would have wanted it this way. The dress was perfect, ivory silk that flowed like water, with delicate pearl buttons that caught the cathedral's stained glass light. But it was the man waiting for her at the altar who made Bea's heart sing. Richard stood tall and magnificent in his black tuxedo, his steel blue eyes never leaving her face as she approached. Gone was the cold, calculating mogul who had tried to destroy her 6 months ago. In his place stood a man transformed by love, vulnerable, open, radiating the kind of joy that comes from finally choosing happiness over fear. Thomas walked beside her as ring-bearer, practically vibrating with excitement in his miniature tuxedo. When they reached the altar, he looked up at his father with a grin that could have powered the entire city. "You look happy, Daddy," he whispered, loud enough for the first 3 rows to hear. "That's because I am, son," Richard replied, his voice thick with emotion as he took Bea's hands in his. "Happier than I ever thought possible." The ceremony was a blur of ancient words and modern promises, but Bea would remember 2 moments with perfect clarity for the rest of her life. The first came when Richard spoke his vows, his voice steady and sure as he looked into her eyes. "Bea Silva, you walked into my life like a hurricane and destroyed every wall I'd built around my heart. You saw past my anger to my fear, past my cruelty to my love, past my mistakes to my potential. You fought for me when I wouldn't fight for myself, loved me when I was unlovable, and showed me that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's choosing love despite the fear." His voice cracked slightly. "I promise to choose love every day for the rest of our lives. I promise to be the man you see when you look at me. And I promise that you'll never have to fight for my heart again. It's already yours." The second moment came during the exchange of rings when Thomas suddenly burst into tears. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" Bea whispered, kneeling beside him in her wedding dress. "I'm just so happy," he sobbed, throwing his arms around her neck. "I prayed every night for a mommy who would stay, and God sent me you." There wasn't a dry eye in the cathedral as Bea held him close, this little boy who had stolen her heart as completely as his father had. When she looked up, she saw Richard watching them with an expression of such overwhelming love and gratitude that she thought her heart might burst from the sheer joy of it. The kiss that sealed their marriage was soft and sweet and full of promise. A kiss that tasted like forever, like coming home, like all the happy endings they'd thought were lost to them. As they walked back down the aisle as a family, Bea caught sight of Victoria's sour expression and couldn't help but smile. The woman had spent the entire engagement trying to sabotage their relationship, spreading rumors, threatening Richard's business partners, even attempting to have Bea investigated for fraud. But she'd underestimated the power of a man in love and a woman who refused to be intimidated. The reception was held at the Blackwood Mansion, transformed into a fairy tale with thousands of white roses and twinkling lights. Sophia, Bea's 8-year-old daughter, had flown in from Brazil with Bea's mother, and she immediately attached herself to Thomas like a long-lost sister. "See?" Thomas told her importantly as they snuck cake from the dessert table. I told you my daddy would remember how to smile. He's pretty when he smiles. Sophia agreed, her accent making the words sound like music. Mama says love makes everyone pretty. As the evening wore on, Bea found herself standing on the terrace with Richard, watching their children play in the garden while their guests danced inside. Her mother was deep in conversation with Mrs. Hampton, the two older women bonding over recipes and embarrassing stories about their charges. Regrets? Richard asked softly, pulling her closer against his side. Only one, Bea said, tilting her face up to look at him. Richard's expression grew concerned. What? I wish I could go back and thank that awful man who humiliated me in his office 6 months ago. If he hadn't been such a bastard, I might never have fallen in love with the incredible man he was hiding underneath. Richard's laugh was rich and warm, no longer sharp with cynicism but soft with contentment. That bastard was an idiot. Lucky for him, he had an angel who refused to give up on him. Not an angel, Bea corrected, rising on her tiptoes to brush her lips against his. Just a woman who recognized that some things are worth fighting for. As they kissed under the stars, surrounded by the laughter of their children and the warmth of family, Bea thought about the journey that had brought them here. The humiliation, the fear, the heartbreak, all of it had been necessary to break down the walls that kept them apart. Richard had been right about one thing. Love was dangerous. It required courage, vulnerability, the willingness to risk everything for the chance at happiness. But as she felt her husband's arms tighten around her, as she heard Thomas and Sophia giggling in the garden, as she looked toward a future bright with possibility, Bea realized that some dangers were worth embracing. After all, the best love stories weren't about people who had it easy. They were about people who fought for their happy ending, and won. From inside the mansion came the sound of the band striking up their song, At Last by Etta James, and Richard led her back inside to dance as husband and wife. As they swayed together on the floor where they'd first clashed 6 months ago, Bea caught Victoria watching from the sidelines, her expression no longer furious but strangely wistful. She looks sad, Bea murmured against Richard's ear. Lonely people always look sad at weddings, Richard replied, spinning her gently. They see what they could have if they were brave enough to choose love over pride. Should we feel sorry for her? Richard considered this, then shook his head. We should feel grateful. If she hadn't been so cruel at the gala, I might never have realized how much I needed to protect you. Fighting for you taught me how to fight for us. As the song ended, and another began, Richard dipped her low, his eyes sparkling with mischief and love. Ready for our happily ever after, Mrs. Blackwood? I've been ready since the moment you called me a gold digger, Bea replied, laughing as he spun her around. Though I have to say, you're right about one thing. What's that? I did hit the lottery when I walked into your office that day. Just not the kind you thought. And as Richard kissed her again, surrounded by family and friends and the warm glow of a love that had conquered fear itself, Bea Silva Blackwood knew that some fairy tales do come true, especially for people brave enough to believe in them. The end.